Hey, I'm Kennedy for Reason TV. Hello. And today we're streaming live from Reason's studio in Los Angeles. I'm talking with Timothy Taylor. He's the author of The Sounds of Capitalism. He's a UCLA professor of musicology, and he's tracked music and advertising for nearly a century and how its uses have aligned with the marked rise in consumerism over the years. So welcome, Professor Taylor.
Thank you.
Go Bruins! All right, so obviously it starts with radio's infancy and figuring out that music was a cheap and easy way to reach the masses. How did it all start?
Well, there was music used in advertising before, which I don't look at in the book, but sheet music and medicine shows, and so people were kind of used to that, to the idea that music could be used to sell something. And then when radio comes along, it starts as something that hobbyists did, sort of like the rise of the personal computer. So it took a little while to catch on. But in the 20s, it finally started to catch on, and then the advertising industry, which was used to print, didn't quite know what to do with sound.
Yeah.
And it took them a while to figure out what to do with it, or what to do with radio, and they were really afraid of a hard sell of like radio coming into your home, like an ad in a newspaper, you can just turn the page, but with radio,
yeah, you said that they wanted it to feel like a family member or a friend, someone who was a welcome guest in your home, and they didn't want to offend too many people.
Yep.
So balance those early programmers between classical and jazz.
Yeah, that was a big question. What kind of music to use, and what did people want? But then, what kind of music would best represent the product? So there's a lot of debates about classical versus jazz in particular, but there was a lot of different kind of music that was on the air in those days.
And the variety hours as well,
Yep.
like a single show that would try and give you a little bit of everything.
Yeah, that was a solution they came upon in the late 20s to try to figure out, well, Dad might like to listen to jazz, but, Junior might want to listen to, like sports, and, Mom might want to hear, familiar songs from the 1890s, so they put it all in 1 hour-long show.
Yeah.
And that's how they addressed that problem.
Casting a wide net. And of course you had the Lucky Strike Hour and the Ever Ready Hour and
Yep.
these shows that were named for advertisers. How long did it take before they started blatantly naming things for companies to sell time?
Almost from the beginning, because in that era, before there was a star system, it wasn't that expensive to put on a radio show because they weren't paying stars gazillions of dollars like they do today. So a single company could pay for the production of an entire program. And then if they were doing that, they wanted their name in the title. So a lot of famous radio shows that people might remember or that have been rerun. I mean, I grew up on public radio. They had, they were rerunning old shows. But shows like Fibber McGee and Molly, that was actually called the Johnson's Wax program with Fibber McGee and Molly.
Yeah.
And the Jack Benny program was actually, the Jello program with Jack Benny. Because all of these sponsors, they wanted their names, in the title, and then the names of the musical groups. It would be, like Ipan and Toothpaste sponsored a show, and their band that played all the numbers on the show, that band was called the Ipan and Troubadours.
Yeah.
And that was very common.
And they would sell ginger ale and toothpaste and everything else.
Yep.
And then eventually we got to jingles. And Wheaties had the first successful jingle.
Yeah, in 1926, it didn't really catch on. Jingles didn't catch on until later, but it helped save Wheaties, because Wheaties wasn't a brand that was doing particularly well. So General Mills in Minnesota, which happened to own a radio station, they thought, well, we got to be using this radio station for something.
That's vertical integration right there.
Yeah.
That's the way you do it.
Yeah, and very early. So they sort of cobbled together a barbershop quartet that sang a kind of barbershop-ized version of a popular song from 1919. And that song saved Wheaties, but it didn't really catch on to the extent that people across the country were thinking, we could write a jingle too.
No, but they looked at the sales in Minnesota and thought, like, how is this happening? I mean, they're through the roof.
Yep. Yeah, Wheaties was sort of on the ropes, and the jingle, everybody thinks, saved Wheaties, as which is still around today.
And it's interesting to try and figure out demographics and who's listening and how they learn to do that, because that was an evolving process. And one of the things was, getting people to send in letters, and then they would go through and try and parse the handwriting and the intelligence of the letter writer and try and figure out the age, and also the false cancellations.
Yep. Yeah, they had a number of strategies because, again, the advertising industry was used to print. So they knew that, in this neighborhood in New York City, they sold, X copies of this magazine, whatever. I mean, they knew, and they knew that was in a wealthy neighborhood or a poor neighborhood or whatever. But with advertising, they had no idea. I mean, with radio, they had no idea. And so they would do all kinds of things just to get people to write in, including giving away free products, sponsoring contests, and
Which
then
they still do, all
yep.
that.
And like as you said, people would, or the networks would say, oh, this show, we're going to cancel this show, and then people would write in and say, no, don't cancel the show, even though they had no intention of canceling the show. They just wanted to generate listeners writing in.
An emotional response.
Yep.
And it's funny because jingles were such a huge part of advertising for so long. And who had the first really successful jingle? Was it Pepsi or Chiquita Banana?
It was Pepsi in 1939. Two guys, famously, they walked into Walter Mack, who was the president of Pepsi. And they walked in with a portable phonograph, which existed in that era.
I love technology.
Yeah. And they played a jingle that they had written based on an old English folk song, which means that the copyright didn't have to be paid. And that became the norm if you use an existing folk song. And Walter Mack, who was always trying to find ways to catch up with Coca-Cola, he said, sold, I'll take it. And he didn't spend much money on it. And in that era, which might sound surprising to people today, but in that era, you couldn't lease airtime in packages less than 5 minutes. In other words, if you wanted to get something on the radio, you had to pay for 5 minutes or more. But here was a 60-second jingle. So Walter Mack found down in the dumps radio station, and I think it was in Newark, and they were willing to lease him 60 seconds of airtime. And the jingle proved to be so popular that other stations started leasing 60 seconds of airtime just for that jingle. And this is how we get the 60-second commercial and later the 30-second commercial. But it's all because of this jingle. Pepsi Cola hits the spot, which was hugely, hugely popular and influential both.
And it moved a lot of units. And,
yeah, it did.
And
they used it for decades.
And they were already in the middle of the Cola Wars back then, which is really fascinating because there are so many signposts throughout the Coke-Pepsi feud. It's pretty fascinating. Now, what was the height of the jingle era?
50s, 60s, and 70s. And then in the 80s, it starts to decline. But in those 3 decades, a jingle composer had virtually unlimited budgets. I mean, a jingle composer could write a jingle for a quartet of singers and maybe a 30-piece orchestra. This was before computer technology allowed you to simulate all that with a computer. And they could hire the best studio musicians in LA and New York, and they could just do whatever they wanted. And there's a lot of money to be made, and a lot of really great jingles were written.
And they just get stuck in your head. I mean, literally, like everyone in here could probably recite and sing like 15 jingles, and it's so much fun to do. And you even say that in your book. Like people sit around at your dinner parties, and sing jingles.
Yeah, I mean, this is what academics do. We get together and they say, "Well, what are you working on?" It's like, "Well, I'm working on this book about music and advertising." It's like, "Oh, I remember this jingle. Do you know this jingle?" I mean,
so kiss a little longer.
Yep. People would sing me jingles, and it was great.
You're like, no. That's why you wear headphones wherever you go.
Right. But, in the days when no expense was spared in writing these jingles, really great musicians were writing them. I mean, Herbie Hancock, Barry Manilow wrote some of the best jingles ever, I think. And then there's lots of musicians who are less well known, but were still really good composers.
Yeah, but Barry Manilow was a huge jingle composer.
Yeah.
And then you even say in the book that he started performing a medley of his jingles, and that became one of his most popular songs on tour.
Yeah, before he was a star, one of the ways that he connected with his audience was to sing jingles, because he knew everybody knew them.
With his bank and paid his rent. All right, so there were obviously huge shifts in music and advertising after the Great Depression and during the Second World War and post-war. And one of the interesting things you write about is Freudian advertising. And how did that work with music? What were some of the connections?
Well, the strange thing that I uncovered in writing this book was that, in the movie industry, musicians were always talking about like music and emotion, like what music are we going to use to represent the emotions of what's going on screen, or to ironize what's going on screen, or but to somehow represent or portray what's going on screen. In radio, that wasn't the case at all. Music was thought, the function of music was thought to be to animate a product, because people couldn't see it, so you had to use music to like bring the product to life somehow. And it wasn't really until the very late 50s, early 60s that composers started to say, well, wait a minute, we can start using the emotional effect of music also like they do in films. But it took that long, which is really kind of striking. It's probably because of the holdover the print mentality, in advertising that lasted so long. Interestingly, it was all classical trained composers who were the ones who were pushing this emotional connection.
And I mean, you talk about the lag, but it wasn't until 1967 that advertisers embraced the youth culture, which seems insane. I mean, why did it take so long, and what was the big shift?
Well, the baby booms kind of forced it, but advertisers are still really reluctant because they were always afraid to offend anybody.
And they thought rock and roll was dirty and low class.
Yep, and they were afraid of offending, Southern customers who might not want to hear black music and commercials. So advertised music always lagged behind what was going on in popular music more generally. And it was the same, with the baby boom and youth culture. And when they first started to try to attract the youth, they had no idea. They just, some of the musicians, they would talk about, what they did to try to attract the youth culture, and it sounds laughable today. It's in terms of what they were doing musically, but they figured it out pretty quickly because they knew that there was money to be made, and after a while, people like George Martin, famously produced the Beatles. He was working in advertising by the early '70s.
Yeah.
So when it finally happened, it happened, but it happened mainly because the whole baby boom phenomenon was kind of a juggernaut. So you either had to, jump on or get out of the way.
And baby boomers have been responsible for quite a few shifts in music and advertising, including, the horrible era of like Bob Seger and repurposed songs and Reach Out and Touch Someone and the 80s nostalgia and the Big Chill and all that. I mean, talk about the Reagan era and consumerism. Was this the height of both the music industry and the advertising age?
Well, it's interesting because during the Reagan era, the jingles started to go on their way out because during the 80s, all these baby boomers who were used in the 50s and 60s, they started to assume positions of power in the advertising industry. And they didn't want to hear, what they thought was trite or, sort of cheesy music in advertising. They wanted to hear their own music, either from the 60s or newer music. So that proved to be, hugely effective in helping to continue to promote American consumer culture, which radio helped to promote, even back in the 20s.
Yeah. And it was sacred. Like, consumerism was in consumption was seen as a form of self-creation.
Yeah, it became a kind of patriotic duty, Probably some people here in the room and who are viewing remember that after 9/11, George W. Bush and Mayor Giuliani in New York, where I was living at the time, they didn't say, go out and serve your country or join the armed forces. They said, go out and spend money, like you've got to support the consumer culture. That's what it was about.
Yeah, and that was, this was still at a time where there was economic turmoil, but the idea that the more stuff you had, the happier you would be. I mean, that's something that vein was present throughout advertising and in music, but it really exploded in the 80s.
Yeah, it did. It became, as I say, a kind of sacred duty of people in this country to consume, to have more and more and more and more. So friends of mine at UCLA have conducted a study of everyday lives of families here in Southern California, and one of the things that they've discovered is that virtually nobody uses their garage for their car.
Yeah.
It's full of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny. It's very true. And one of the big things that I remember as a kid was the Michael Jackson Pepsi commercials, because that was huge, and you would wait like breathlessly for the new Michael Jackson commercial, like the 90-second spot. It was such a big deal, and there were so many acts in the 80s who were linked with Hall & Oates and Pontiac and Kenny Rogers and Dole Pineapple, because when I see that sandy white beard, all I want to do is dive into Hawaiian pineapple.
Yep. Yeah, no, that became an important way for a lot of musicians to get new music out there.
Yeah.
It was through commercials.
And have their tours supported and make some scratch. And you said in your book you cannot underestimate the importance of MTV. MTV launched in 1981, and it was music driving visuals, and this was a total shift and an ownership of advertising and music and culture by youth completely. So explain that, like what was happening at the time and what has been the influence?
Well, people in the industry, they were used to music, sort of underlying or being the foundation for an ad. And with MTV, they came to realize that music can drive the visuals. It's not the other way around. And the idea that music could play, an even more powerful role in commercials, and not just as an emotional underpinning, but as using a particular kind of music to attract a particular kind of consumer. That became much more prominent in the 80s and after.
Yeah, I mean, my Adidas, Run DMC, they were always linked with Adidas, and they wrote the song because they really loved Adidas, and Adidas was kind of giving them free stuff, but then they inked a huge deal.
Yep.
And this is one of the most interesting things. You talk about the Nike Revolution commercial and the series of spots using Beatles' Revolution, because Michael Jackson was like, yeah, sure, I own the rights. Go ahead and have them.
Yep.
And Yoko Ono signed off on it, but the band was furious.
Yeah, the surviving members were very unhappy, but they didn't own the rights to their own music anymore. So there wasn't much they could do. They sued Nike. And it was settled out of court, and Nike pulled that ad. But that was a major shift, because if the Beatles were going to let their music be used, I mean, they didn't, but a lot of people thought that they were letting their music be used in commercials, and that changed a lot of things.
It created panic, and this notion of selling out was huge in the 90s, and there were a lot of bands who just wouldn't be caught dead, and music consumers who would be very disappointed with the rise of alternative music if their bands actually sold out. Nirvana and Pearl Jam would have never sold the rights to their music to Nike or McDonald's or anything like that. God forbid. Nowadays, is there such a thing as selling out?
I don't think so. I don't think my students care about it at all. When I started teaching in the 90s, they cared a lot, like you say. In the height of the grunge movement, it was very clear. My students thought, a band is a sellout if they appear on MTV. Sorry,
we had to fight that the whole time in the 90s.
Yeah.
It was really tough, and it was a dynamic that took over the network for a few years.
Yeah, but appearing on MTV, doing a commercial, or signing to a major label, that made you a sellout. And the students of the same age today, they don't seem to care. And I don't think that they are less political. I just think they have a more complex notion of what constitutes selling out. I think for them, if a band gets too popular, I think that's not really selling out. But then, they'll turn their attention to somebody else.
Yeah.
But I think they have conceptions of what selling out is, but it's not what it was in the 90s. It's very different.
No, and now it's such a different era, and I think it's great, because not only do consumers have control over the means of production. I mean, you can literally create your own music with limited technology and resources, but you can also consume it in any way you want, whether it's iTunes and YouTube. And you said you can't overstate the impact of MTV. Can the same be said for YouTube and iTunes?
Maybe not YouTube yet. My students use it a lot, but to make it, what matters, I think, to young people is that the music is made portable, so they can have it on their device all the time.
All of your music, all of the time, on your phone.
Yep. And you can do that with YouTube, but it's more cumbersome than if you're using iTunes or Spotify or one of these kinds of streaming services. And I think they use it like at home on the computers. But for them, I think what really matters is having everything instantly available, so that they can, access whatever music they want whenever they want, including during my lectures, I think.
And commercials now break bands.
Yep.
And I want you to talk about the relationship between DVRs and music, because people conceivably don't have to sit through any commercials at all. Commercials have to be so compelling. So is this actually the best medium for bands to get their music out there?
Well, after the Communications Act of 1996, which made it possible for, basically the monopolization of radio. I mean, a single corporation could own every rock station in LA if it wanted to. That made it a lot harder for musicians to get radio airplay, because, a single entity would just streamline all of its playlists, or standardize all of its playlists. And then all of a sudden, really, after 1996, it was a lot harder for bands to get on the air. And that was why musicians became much more willing to let their music be used in TV commercials, or they sought to get their music put in films or in TV shows, which is why you see so much of that nowadays. But at the same time, you have the rise of the DVR, right? So now I think it's probably even harder for musicians, to get their music out there, because if they're relying on getting their music in a commercial, people may skip through it. So the measure of success today, it might have been, getting in a couple of commercials, getting a song or two in a couple of hit TV shows, maybe put in a film. Now I think, it matters less being put in a commercial, because you just don't know if people are going to see it.
And your book is called The Sounds of Capitalism. Do you like capitalism?
If it's managed, like they do in Western.
Whoa, easy.
Like they do in Western Europe, in which.
No.
But which we don't.
Yeah, we need high-speed rail for music.
I think in the 50s and 60s when our economy was booming and the government strongly regulated American capitalism, I think it worked very well. I mean, now with free market policies and deregulation policies, we've seen what happens. The economy tanked in 2007. We're still struggling to recover, and that's because the government is playing.
It was going so well. I was literally like, the last 30 seconds, all I've heard is blah, 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 blah. Because I have to tell you, the deregulation of culture, taking music back from major labels, smaller acts reaching larger audiences through, first MySpace and now Facebook, social media, it's been fantastic. And I think any government regulation would have totally destroyed that creativity.
But if you're a working musician, the fact is it's a lot harder to make a living than it used to be.
If you're a non-working musician, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder for janitors to make a living. It's a lot harder for everybody. And some could make the case it's because we're overtaxed and overregulated. And if the free market were able to prevail as it should in the arts and music especially, the best stuff makes its way out there. And now there is greater means for people to consume great music and even mediocre music.
Maybe, but musicians who have their music on Spotify make a fraction of a cent for each song paid. They're not making a living off of Spotify.
You're talking about an entire
RDIO.
generation who thinks that music is free, and the way bands make money now is they go out and play shows. They sell merchandise.
If they can.
Yeah, and labels are making. I mean, the consolidation of the music industry. I think you could see the parallel between that and advertising.
Yeah, it's been very hard on musicians. This hasn't been hard on the executives, but it's been hard on the musicians.
Oh no, I'll show you dozens of people that I knew who had great jobs and handsome expense accounts in the 90s when record companies were thriving, who are now realtors.
Yeah, no.
Those jobs don't exist anymore.
Yeah, but it's there's been a trend towards monopolization, which has hurt the musicians horribly. I mean, Walmart basically now controls the distribution of recordings.
People don't buy their music at Walmart. People buy their music on iTunes. And by the way, iTunes is the best way for music lovers to find other stuff that they want to see, because based on what they buy, that's the free market working right there. Okay, we unfortunately have to go, but I will give you the last word. Go ahead.
Well, if you're still somebody who wants to buy a physical recording, then you have to. Then whatever Walmart charges for distribution,
go to your local record store. Support your local record store.
Walmart is still distributing to them, unless it's a used record store, which I still support.
Amen. Ha! You and I both. Tim Taylor, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for joining us. Remember to check Reason.com for more live events. For Reason TV, I'm Kennedy.